What's up, people? So I'm going to go ahead and go through Learning Community Activity 2 and also prepare you for some of the stuff that I'm going to discuss in the next video about Nietzsche, right? So Learning Community Activity 2 asks you to look at some examples from Boroditsky's work that you found compelling and some that you found more problematic. And the thing we should be keeping in mind here is that Steven Pinker's argument against linguistic relativism is that some of the examples that his proponents use are trivial, right? They don't demonstrate the far-reaching impact on thought that he thinks is necessary to demonstrate the linguistic relativity hypothesis, right? And so that's the question we need to be asking ourselves. Are these examples significant, right, or are they more trivial? And I think that Boroditsky does have some examples of some pretty far-reaching impacts that language has on our thinking, right? One of the ones I find most convincing is this discussion of spatial reasoning or directional terms, right? I think it's a fact that Americans in particular have a lot of trouble orienting ourselves in the world around us, right? Like, just to take myself, for example, whenever I'm driving around, I always have to think, if I want to know where I'm oriented in space, I always got to think, east is New Jersey, west is the ocean, north is San Francisco, so on and so forth. That's how I orient myself. And if I can't figure out what direction New Jersey is in or what direction the ocean's in, I just have no idea what direction I'm headed in, right? And so that seems to be a big disadvantage of relative directional terms, right? In contrast, these people that she's discussing that have these absolute cardinal directional terms, they can very easily orient themselves in space, right? So they immediately know what direction's west, what direction's north, and so forth. And we can see how that would immediately be very useful in figuring out how to orient ourselves in the world around us, right? I also think the grammatical gender example is pretty convincing. There are some people that suggested that this might have more to do with culture than language, and I think it's pretty tough to make that argument just because a lot of the things that we're talking about are real sort of mundane everyday objects like bridges and keys, and also the cultures are relatively close together too. They're both Western cultures, and so it's hard to imagine that there would be these big differences in how they understood bridges just based on culture, right? And it's pretty, it seems not so coincidental that when it's a feminine object, it tends to be described in feminine terms. When it's a masculine object, it tends to be described in masculine terms, right? And so I think that's another really good example of a sort of far-reaching impact that language has on thought, right? As far as the chronological, the example I think that is more trivial, more along the lines of what Pinker's talking about, is the one where she's talking about the chronological arrangement of time, right? And how we spatially arrange temporal objects, right? And the example she gave is people arranging pictures in chronological order, right? And speakers with cardinal directions obviously arrange the pictures based on their body, right? Either from left to right or right to left, depending on how people read, right? While people with those absolute directional systems tended to arrange them. I think it was from east to west, if I remember correctly, right? And that's interesting. It's really interesting, but it's hard to see what kind of impact that has on their thinking about time, right? And so I would need some additional argumentation in order to be convinced of that, right? Now, the one problem that we don't want to get ourselves into, though, is really illustrated really well with Learning Community 1 here, right? And basically what they argued is that we want to be real careful about absolutizing these linguistic differences, right? So, for example, one of the examples she gave was the different color terms, right? Where Russian has those two different words for blue, right? And English just has one word, right? And so Russians have a more sensitive understanding of the difference between certain shades of blue, right? Now, does that mean that English speakers have a less sophisticated understanding of blue, right? It depends. It depends on which Russian speaker we're talking about and which English speaker we're talking about, right? So you can imagine real easily where an English speaker might be a painter or something, right? And they may have multiple terms for different shades of blue and might even have a more nuanced understanding of blue than some Russian speakers do, right? And you can imagine some Russian speakers who, despite having this difference, maybe because of their background, right, just don't understand blue in these sophisticated ways, right? Same thing with the directional terms that I was talking about earlier, right? Just because it's perhaps more likely that Western speakers that use relative directions are going to have difficulty orienting themselves in an environment, that doesn't mean that's true for everybody, right? right? And there's all kinds of people, like maybe hunters or people that navigate on boats or something like that, that may have a much better understanding of where they are in their environment, right? And so language is complicated, right? It doesn't exist by itself. We learn multiple different kinds of languages as we move throughout. We don't just learn English, but we learn other kinds of Englishes too, right? And we learn all kinds of other practices as we go through our lives, and that's all going to impact how we understand the world around us, right? So it's really important not to view language as a straitjacket, to not use it as an excuse to draw ridiculous generalizations about cultures, right? And she gets in that towards the end of her piece, right, where she's talking about this one group, the Arrante group. I think I pronounced that right. And the Arrante group, they have, instead of having number terms the way we do, where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth, they have terms that correspond with one, two, few, and many, right? And so one question researchers ask themselves is, does that have an impact on how they think about the world around them, right? Are they able to determine exact quantities as well as English speakers are, right? And I kind of flipped off of it here, and I just want to go through the example here and talk about it a little bit, right? And so what they did, and I'm just going to go ahead and read this, what the researchers did is, David Wilkins presented Arrante elders with two groups of pebbles about the same size. One was 63 and one was 60 pebbles. When he asked an Arrante how many pebbles there were, he would get the Arrante word for many as the answer for both piles. Then he would say in Arrante, oh, so they are the same. And the elders would think and say no, and then that one pile had more or was bigger. When asked bigger by how many, they would answer by showing 3 more lines in the sand, and so on and so forth, right? And so what this shows is that they are capable of determining exact quantities, right? Because they aren't limited by their inability or by their lack of knowledge of cardinal, of these number words, right? There are all kinds of other ways of thinking that go beyond just the languages that we use, right? In this case, they're using some pictorial reasoning to help establish what exact quantities are. But there are all kinds of other ways of thinking that go beyond just language, right? And what Boroditsky, I think, is trying to say here is that language is just part of the rich tapestry of different practices that we call thinking, right? It's just one part of that, right? And there are all kinds of other thinking that isn't just language, right? And so instead of thinking of language as separate from thought and wondering what the influence of the two is, right? We got to think of language as integrated with all kinds of different thought and part of that entire framework, right? Now, some of this stuff is going to echo, hopefully for you, some of the stuff that Nietzsche talks about in his piece, right? So later she says this on page 628. She says, each language is an incredibly useful guidebook to the world. It comes with ways of categorizing, differentiating, organizing, and making sense of objects, so on and so forth. And she's emphasizing here how useful language is, right? It's like a storehouse of all the knowledge that our culture has accumulated over the years, right? It makes it easier for us to deal with the world around us, right? We don't have to relearn everything because our language comes equipped with certain ways of thinking about the world around us, right? And so she's emphasizing the useful parts of it, right? But Nietzsche, you'll notice, emphasizes how its limitations, right? He shows that our language doesn't just give us handy ways of thinking about the world, right? It also limits us from thinking about the world in other ways, right? And so that's why we need people to come along, what he calls the man of intuition, man in quotation marks, right? To disrupt language, to think of other ways of approaching and dealing with the world around us, right? And so there's a parallel between these two thinkers, right? And they're talking about language in very similar ways in some respects, right? But they're emphasizing very different things, right? While Boroditsky's emphasizing how it's practical and useful, Nietzsche's emphasizing how it's limiting and problematic, right? And so if you're wondering what the connection between these thinkers are, that might be one way of thinking about it.